Good evening again, everybody, and welcome to the June Acting for Justice gathering. My name is Jack Jezreel. I serve on the staff of Just Faith Ministries, and I'm delighted that you could join us tonight. And so let's begin our evening in prayer. Let us pray. God of heaven and earth, we acknowledge that life is a tricky balance, and money is tricky stuff. It's as if every cell in our bodies carries two cores. Within the first, our hands and hearts hold fast, gripped by a primal fear of want, of hunger, of scarcity. But within that first core nests a still deeper one. And there, our hearts and hands are flung wide open, embracing beauty, so full they could not possibly begin to constrict in a white-knuckled fist of fear. So, gracious God, be present with us when we hold fast. Move us, with a shove if need be, to that deeper place where all we have is a gift, ready to be given away. In Christ's name, amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you tonight's speaker. Chuck Collins is the director of the program on inequality and the common good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits Inequality.org. His new book, The Wealth Hoarders, How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions, is about the wealth hiding industry. He's the author of the popular book, Born on Third Base, A One Percenter Makes the Case for Tackling Inequality, Bringing Wealth Home, and Committing to the Common Good. And with Bill Gates Sr., the book, Wealth and Our Commonwealth, A Case for Taxing Inherited Fortunes. He is also co-author with Mary Wright, who is on our call tonight, and who some of you might remember as a former staff member at Just Faith Ministries, the book entitled The Moral Measure of the Economy, about Christian ethics and economic life. He is a founding board member of the group Patriotic Millionaires. And Chuck, we're just delighted you could join us this evening.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Leela. It's great to be with all of you. As I was telling Leela and Jack, there's a storm coming through. So if for some reason you see a flash of light and I go off the screen, I'll try to rejoin, but otherwise Mary Wright will have to take over and fill in. So just kidding. I'm thrilled to see Mary Wright here as well. And she and I had a lot of fun doing day-long programs for Catholic Campaign for Human Development on Catholic social teaching and economic life and traveling and working together. So it's great to see her, and just a little bit more personal context. I was, we're talking about these issues of economic inequality, which are so relevant to the time we're living in. I myself grew up in the wealthiest 1%. My great grandfather was the meatpacker Oscar Mayer, so I have that nice German Catholic heritage from Wisconsin. We kind of, my father used to say, bringing home the bacon means something different in our family. And it's given me some insight into a front row seat, if you will, to sort of some of the dynamics of how inequality plays out. But when I was in my 20s, I also had this experience of working with Catholic Relief Services in Mexico and El Salvador, helped doing earthquake relief and working in a refugee camp. And sort of getting a kind of global window into the economic inequalities of our time. So that really informed a decision I made in my mid-20s to give away the inheritance that I had and effectively be disinherited from future wealth. And you would think that would be a formative life event. But what was striking to me now, looking back many, many years, is how little may have actually changed, meaning how much other advantage flowed to me as somebody who was born in the United States. Well, I'm white, I'm male, I, you know, have a debt-free college education. I have a sort of a mountain of other advantages. So I come to this topic with a certain amount of, I guess, humility and curiosity as to what are both the systems that fuel these inequalities and hold them in place, but also what are the sort of stories that we tell ourselves and the sort of that sort of hold these inequalities in place as well. So I want to talk with you about those. And I guess I would start because I think it is, my experiences right now is kind of a, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of every day I talk to somebody who says, I have no idea what to make of the moment we're in, from a democracy point of view, from an ecological point of view, from a political point of view. Where are we and where are we heading? And I guess I would just start by saying I think there's some interesting and good news, which is, as a society, we are really awakening to these issues of inequality, to the racial wealth divide. And there's a tremendous appetite for change. And it may not look that way, but that's the undercurrent of the moment. So I want to start with that and talk with you about what we see happening. But let me, and I refrain from using a PowerPoint presentation because I think you all pretty much probably have the picture, if you will. I mean, we've been living through over 40 years of gradual pulling apart, both in terms of income and wealth and sort of opportunity. We're becoming a much more unequal society. And actually, when we go into breakout questions, I'm curious to hear your reflections on what you see as the signs of the times that you see in terms of these inequalities. But let me offer a couple of pieces of the picture. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the data or the problem, but one of the trends I've noticed is starting really in the late 70s is when real wages started to flatten and stagnate. And for the bottom 60% of households, pretty much stayed stagnant for decades. The second phase of the inequalities, which I would date starting around 2000, at the millennial, at the year 2000, was not only income inequality, meaning a big gap between highest and average workers, but a growing concentration of wealth. But making a distinction, both income and wealth, both of those are areas where we're seeing greater inequality. And that in the last decade, you've heard the phrase the 1%, people talking about the wealthiest 1%, but actually the lion's share of income and wealth gains are going not to the 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%, people with wealth over $30 million. So we're seeing kind of an acceleration of inequality, and the pandemic has contributed to that. We'll talk about that. But let me just offer three interesting little facts. One, the United States, we have roughly 760 billionaires, people with wealth over $1 billion. That's up from about 30 billionaires in 1983. So a very tremendous growth. And that group, their share of the wealth pie just continues to grow. 760 people have almost $5 trillion of wealth. 2 trillion of that, what growth in wealth has occurred since March 2020, since the beginning of the pandemic. So we're seeing an extraordinary acceleration of concentration of wealth during the pandemic. And so think about that in juxtaposition to the lives and livelihoods and long-term impacts of the COVID pandemic and this extraordinary imbalance of rewards. So that's one fact. Almost a $2 trillion increase in wealth, 760 people seen their wealth increase $2 trillion. What's $1 trillion? I don't have a pithy summary of that, but it's $1,000 billion. Second fact, how many people have zero or negative wealth? If you think about wealth as what you own minus what you owe, turns out there's a fairly large segment of people, roughly 20%, about a fifth of society, that has zero or negative net worth. But if we look at that through a racial lens, it's about 14% of white households, zero or negative wealth, but 28% of Black households and 26% of Latino households, zero or negative wealth. So that's one of the indicators of the racial wealth divide and how people's experience of living close to the financial edge and how many households. And actually, the next fifth, if you will, has very little as well. So really, we're talking about the bottom 40% of households have very little by way of financial reserves or nest eggs. And that really affected how people experienced the pandemic. If people had any kind of cushion or reserve, it made a huge difference. Third little fun fact, and this is very much related to the new book that I have out that Jack mentioned. We estimate at the global level that about $36 trillion of wealth is not even being added to the measurements, which is hidden, sequestered in offshore tax havens, in trusts, in shell companies, $36 trillion. And that isn't even in the equation or the data that I've mentioned. And part of what's happening there's been an acceleration, again, among households with $30 million or more of people hiring essentially lawyers, tax attorneys, wealth managers, accountants, essentially hiring enablers and facilitators to move the wealth off the public ledger to the shadows. And this is an area that I've spent a lot of time working on the last couple of years. It's not really going to be the focus of my talk tonight, but I actually mentioned to Jack that I've been doing a presentation called "How to Hide $1 Billion: Oligarchs, Kleptocrats, and Their Enablers." And if you're interested in that topic, invite me back and we can kind of do an exploration, because we're essentially not going to be able to address some of these larger issues of systemic inequality when so much of the wealth of the world is in the shadows and out of reach. So, I think that one of the things that's happened during the pandemic is that the existing inequalities that we went into prior to, say, February 2020, have been supercharged. People who had substantial wealth have seen their wealth increase. The market has been volatile the last couple months, but I'm really still talking about a tremendous wealth surge among people at the very top. And we don't have the data quite yet because it lags a little while, but I think we're going to see eroding savings and economic security and well-being. So we're going to see people who were economically precarious going into the pandemic are probably more precarious. Even though the federal relief, the stimulus bills, the unemployment benefits actually made a huge difference and kept things from getting even worse than they would have been. Still, I would anticipate that we will look back at the last couple of years and see that the racial wealth divide did not narrow during the pandemic, it widened. But I think that is part of our shared experience. I'm struck, and I look at attitudes and opinion polls and how people think about these questions, just how much more people are focused on the harms caused by these inequalities. And there's a tremendous appetite to fix them. And some of the proposals I'll talk about, have a huge popularity. 70, 80% of the population, cross political party and age and affiliation and all that, support addressing the extreme inequalities that we're living through. And one reason for that is I think that it's more clear what the harms are. I think in the past, if you shared the statistics that I just mentioned to you, people would say, well, too much inequality is probably not a good thing, but there's a lot of benefits to the kind of market economy that we have. It helps create tremendous wealth. It has an upside. It's a free market economy. What I think we'll find now is people saying, oh, that the economy is like the rules of the economy are now tipped in favor of people who have substantial assets, and that there's something wrong with that, and people use the word the economy is rigged or the rules are rigged. And again, that cuts across political affiliation and the like. People just see that that's a broken problem. And I guess I would argue that these inequalities, and I think the framing of the discussion as, how does inequality affect the beloved community? These inequalities are harmful to everything we care about. Care about democracy. Too much wealth in few hands is a distortion of power. It creates imbalances and volatility. It creates some people with tremendous fear and insecurity and a susceptibility to a sort of scapegoating and blaming culture. I think we now know it really undermines the U.S. ideal of social mobility. I think some of us grew up at a time when you could say, well, after World War II, you could be born in the bottom fifth and you wouldn't necessarily, even with the college degree, you could get into the middle class, or people born in the middle class could rise to, economic stability and prosperity. There was actual social mobility. It cut across race. It was obviously there's a tremendous racial wealth divide and certain barriers to people of color getting on the wealth building train. But even in going into the 60s and early 70s, the income gap between races, between gender was narrowing. We were growing together. And now we've dramatically pulled apart. And we now know that has an effect on social mobility, that people are pretty much stalled out wherever they were started. And that if you want the American dream today, you're better off living in Canada. If you're not born wealthy and you want to have home ownership, access to debt-free education, a living wage, retirement security, leave something for your children. If you want that framing of the American dream, you're better off living in Canada, where there's 3 times the social mobility today than there is in the US. So these inequalities affect and undermine that. It actually is bad for the economy. Too much inequality means there's speculation at the top and not enough people with money in their pocket to participate in the consumer economy. And so it fuels these volatility. And so I like to point out that societies with less inequality actually have more economic stability and steady economic healthy growth, as opposed to this kind of gyrating volatility that we're living through now. And even societies like the Nordic countries have higher rates of entrepreneurship per capita than the US, meaning people who are not born wealthy can have the opportunities to start businesses, knowing that there's a little bit of a social safety net there if things don't go well. And that means more people can participate in those opportunities. And finally, I would say too much inequality kind of blocks our nimbleness and ability as a society to respond to big problems. So the polarization, the capture of our democratic institutions by large donors. If you care about climate change, our ability to respond in a meaningful way is thwarted by the inequalities and how that affects our political system. So anyway, I could go on, but just to say, I think it matters to everybody. And actually, I make the case to people who grew up in my circumstances that too much inequality is bad for everyone. It's bad for those who are wealthy. You don't want to live in a society that is an economic apartheid society. It undermines the common good, and it undermines the quality of life for everybody. And part of my work is to engage with high net worth individuals around why this matters and how they can help reduce inequality. So let me talk a little bit about solutions. I'm sure that's, and things that we can do and how I think about that. And one thing I would say is, there are different types of solutions. So inequality is a huge, big system issue. If you think about what are the societies I mentioned, like the Nordic countries or Canada or the United States after World War II, what was it that made those less unequal? What was different about the years 1945 to 1975, say? I would argue that we had three types of public policies, and we'll talk about private actions and values and those things as well. But there were three types of public policies that made a difference. One, there were things that raised the floor. And the Nordic countries have a much higher, I would call it a decency floor. You could call it a safety net. But there's a level at which it's very hard for people to fall as far as they conceivably fall in the United States. There is a guaranteed income. There is universal health insurance. There's access to job retraining. So if for some reason you lose your job, you're not living in your car. There's a safety net. There's a minimal threshold. So there are things that we can do to reduce inequality that raise the floor, raise the minimum wage, raise expand access to health insurance, support childcare for low-wage workers. All these things kind of lift the floor and make a difference. The second category is things that expand opportunity for non-wealthy people, access to quality education, access to special vocational training and higher education, college. Again, societies with less inequality don't have the levels of student debt that we have here. There is access to home ownership. And if you think about after World War II, we as a society made a huge investment in expanding access to affordable housing and home ownership. Again, there was racial discrimination in the mortgage lending, but there were a lot of things we did right about making investments that lifted up and created opportunity for non-wealthy people to participate in the economy. And the third category of interventions or types of policies are things that address the concentration of wealth and power. So again, in the Nordic countries, there are wealthy, very wealthy individuals, but there's a more progressive tax system. There's a focus on broadening ownership. So more employees have ownership interests in companies, and so they share in the wealth of the private. So think about rate. So to reduce the inequalities that we're living with here in the US, we have to do things that raise the floor, expand opportunity, restore mobility, and address the concentration of wealth and power. But that last category is the least popular, the most controversial, because it's considered, when you start to talk, most people will say, well, let's address poverty, let's overcome poverty, let's do things to lift up people who are trapped in systemic poverty. But, does how wealthy the wealthy are really matter? Is that something we should be concerned about? Isn't that a form of idolatry? Are we envious or fomenting class war? And so we're not going to talk about that. And that's my experience, having worked on these issues for almost 30 plus years, is there's a lot of consensus around raising the floor and even investing in opportunity, but we don't run. But I would make the point, we're not going to make progress unless we address the concentration of wealth and power, because it's so distorting. It's because it's a form of power. And I think that's one of the challenges in this moment. And that's why it's important to engage wealthy people we know who have substantial assets, in a conversation about all of our self-interest, all of our interest as a society of not going down this path. Because, and here's what I've often said to some of my peers is, if we stay on this trajectory, and the French economist Thomas Piketty says, if you allow the levels of the machinery of inequality to keep just going on its own, how it's currently wired, we will continue to pull apart. That the ruts of poverty, the barriers to mobility will continue to get deeper, and the concentration of wealth and power will grow. And so, as he would say, a generation from now, if we stay on this trajectory, we will have in the US a hereditary aristocracy of wealth and power, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our politics, culture, philanthropy, and the economy. And we'll see the rise of greater monopolies and family dynasties. And you may be thinking, well, aren't we kind of there? But actually, keep playing this out another 15, 20 years, we will become more so. It will be even harder to reverse these inequalities. So one of my exhortations, if you will, as we tackle this, is we can't ignore the disruption caused by these concentrations of wealth and power. The other is we have to, in the process of this, it's not all about laws and politics, it's about the narratives, the stories. We have a dominant story in our culture that justifies the racial and economic divide that we're talking about. And if I were to put it on a bumper sticker, I call it the narrative of deservedness. And it's basically everyone is where they deserve to be. That is the dominant story about inequality in the US. Meaning, I often will give people the statistics and they'll say, well, but the people who have that wealth, they deserve it. They've invented something useful. They've taken entrepreneurial risks. They are talented, and our society would be impoverished without their gifts. And the people who are in that bottom 40% who've not been able to save money, who have zero or negative wealth, there's something wrong with them. They don't work as hard. They don't apply themselves. They don't postpone gratification. They in the study of the donuts, they take the first donut, they don't wait for the second donut. There's a whole story, a powerful story. And the thing about it is there's a kernel of truth in it, in that what each of us does, and we can think about that in our families even. There are people who, are go-getters and hustle, and they good livelihoods, and they, you could say they merit a higher standard of living. And there are people, for whatever reason, but you could talk about it in a multi-generational sense, the multi-generational legacy of trauma or lack of sense of agency, or however, but that story does not, that might explain maybe why Jack or Leela should, they work harder than me. Maybe they should be paid a little bit more. But the the levels of inequality that we're living through have nothing, they're delinked from these stories of individual merit and achievement. A society, we as a society might have inequalities based on effort and investment in education, but they're not going to be, 1,000 to 1. They might be 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 or 4 to 1, but they're not going to be the kind of grotesque levels of inequality. And yet we take that story of deservedness and we project it onto these economic trends. And I can't tell you if I got a nickel for every time somebody's responded to this, the absolute uncontestable data about inequality with, well, some people deserve what they have and don't have. If I got a nickel every time I heard that, I could get a lot more money again. So that story is very powerful, and part of the challenge of addressing these inequalities is how do we tease out that story? And I can think of people I know who are like first generation immigrants who have literally come to this country with nothing and have worked really, made huge heroic sacrifices for their children and have left a nest egg for them. And you want to say, well, that what they did matters, and people should be honored and celebrated and rewarded for their efforts. But we have deeply systemic inequalities at this point. So you want to celebrate the individual, but as we also have to look at these systems. And that's where it really makes a difference if each of us think about the stories that we have been told or told about, or that we tell ourselves about wherever we are, and sort of look at them through that lens of both how did I get help, and how did society help me, or what were the barriers that were more systemic that I encountered, to have honest conversations about how disadvantage and advantage work. We all like to think we are where we are because of our effort, particularly if people are in the top 20%. But we need to be truthful, and including looking at systemic racism. So, I have a deep friend, Diedrich Asante Muhammad. He and I are born the same year, and we've actually, our families get together for a week every summer. We spend a lot of time together. And one time he and I just did our little family timeline and looked at what was the help my family gave me, and what were, going back 3 generations really, because it is a multi-generational story. And then, realizing when my, one of my uncles from a non-wealthy side of my family got his first home in Ohio, bought a farm with a farmer's home mortgage, 1% 40-year mortgage that made all the difference in that family. His family in Chicago was excluded from access to traditional lending and was only able to get a predatory loan to buy their family house, which then they lost because of this, kind of a sort of a mortgage and scam. So we could sort of look at the barriers in his life and the advantages, the wind at my back in that process, and sort of understand that there were systems at work here. Anyway, that's a bit on the narrative. And let me just say that I think that, some of the kind of cool things I see happening that are out there there is a movement to address the issue of student debt. There are in many of our states efforts to make community college free or much more affordable and more accessible. There are investments in vocational training and learning trade skills, which are so important and valuable in our economy. There's more of a movement to make those investments that would create that kind of opportunity. And the move to cancel student debt is just one of a number of things in that space. But I'm excited to see that. It's tough to look right now at what's happening in Washington, D.C. and sort of I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of time last year hoping that lawmakers would pass this Build Back Better bill, which originally started off as a $4 trillion investment that included things like the child tax credit, which during its 18-month run lifted thousands, tens of thousands of families out of poverty. The simple child tax credit, and income support for low-wage families, low-income families. And that's completely stalled out. And I do think something will probably pass before the fall that is aimed at, but it will be a fraction. But the thing to remember is that legislation came within 2 votes in the US Senate of passing. We almost passed essentially a Green New Deal, $4 trillion investment package that would have made huge differences in our communities. It would have invested hundreds of billions in affordable housing. It would have invested hundreds of billions in green infrastructure. It would have created essentially a Peace Corps for young people wanting to work on climate change issues. 2 votes different. That would have become the law of the land. So while it may look discouraging, and we may look back and say that was a huge lost opportunity, that shows how popular that was actually. That the proposals in that legislation were wildly popular, and the proposals on paying for them by restoring tax, progressivity at a higher tax rate on the very wealthy is wildly popular. People believe that the wealthy are not paying their fair share. 70-80%, majority of Republicans, majority of Democrats and independents all believe the tax code is broken, and that wealthy people are not paying their fair share, and that wealthy people should pay their fair share, and these investments should be made that would reduce inequality. That we came close to that being the law of the land. Third, there is a huge appetite for addressing the racial wealth divide. Now, there's a big debate over this issue of reparations, but if you sort of break it down and say, we have a 40% gap in the home ownership rate between white households and Black households. That is the legacy of racism in mortgage lending and government-funded mortgages. 72% of white households own a home, 43%, 42%, or less. I guess it's a 30% gap. Sorry, get my statistic right here. 30% gap, but still a major gap in the percentage of home ownership. So there's a recognition that that's unhealthy for a society, that we have to deal with the legacy of racism in wealth building, in access to opportunities of all kinds. And those are powerful and popular policies. And people are trying to figure that out, not just at the federal level, but in states and localities. And I guess the other thing I'll just mention that I'm pretty involved in is this affordable housing crisis, which is touching so many, not everywhere in the United States, but a lot of communities. The gap between what houses cost and what people can afford, and just the rise of people without homes, the rental housing crisis, the fact that people can't find affordable rental housing, the quality of our housing stock in some places, and the gap between what people, young people and access to home ownership. And that is a issue that touches so many. I have 3 children in their 20s. All of them are struggling in the housing market, just to find affordable rental housing in 3 different parts of the United States. That's a universal experience. And so there's a tremendous desire, an undercurrent of pressure wanting to address that. So I think that, and I think, if I got to, decide what the policies would be. I would promote things that sort of linked reducing the concentration of wealth and power with things that make investments that expand opportunity for everyone else. So for instance, why is it that if, let's say, you do 2 years of national service, and I have a son who's graduating tomorrow from AmeriCorps city year in Boston, so I'm going to his graduation. If you do, say, 2 years of national service, working like Caleb did in a public school, working in a national park, why wouldn't you get access to a debt-free college education or debt-free vocational training? Like, why not have it paid for by a progressive tax on inherited wealth? Like, there's a big idea: tax wealth, invest it in expanding universal access to education, eliminate the scourge of student debt, and reward people who do 2 years of national service, could be military or civilian service, and they don't have student debt. That helps kind of reweave the broken social fabric as well. So that's like a big idea that certain people are talking about. Or take this housing crisis in every jurisdiction. Why don't we tax luxury real estate transfers? A lot of our cities have massive booms in luxury real estate. Much of that housing isn't even being lived in. It's investment property, it's wealth parking itself in real estate. Some of that's global wealth coming into the US. Let's tax luxury transfers and create investment funds for affordable housing and rental housing. So those, I think, are some of the types of solutions that are out there. Raise the floor, create opportunity, address the concentration of wealth. And maybe I'll close with just a thought, which is, I think, you may not have many speakers who, like myself, kind of grew up in the 1%. But I think there are allies there. We're all God's children, and there are some potential allies. There are people waiting to be invited to the table, to be engaged with. I like to think that privilege is a disconnection drug. It keeps people apart. That was my experience growing up, that having certain advantages kept me from being in authentic relationships and really understanding the nature of human suffering as well as joy and opportunity. And so, I think part of it is to think about how do we engage and invite people to the table to be part of solutions as opposed to antagonizing them, and have conversations about, well, what's it really going to take to reverse these inequalities? So yeah, in conclusion, I would say, don't forget about this concentration of wealth and power as part of what we need to fix. Think about the power of stories, the stories we tell ourselves and tell one another about deservedness and meritocracy, and how those don't really entirely explain these extreme inequalities we're living through. And then join campaigns, join small groups, pull your Just Faith community together and pick things that will matter to you and that make sense to you, and lean into them. There's, none of us can do this alone. People say, well, is there something I can do on my own to address these inequalities? Well, actually, no. There are ways in which we can think about the issue of stories and telling a true story about your own experience. But ultimately, we need social action groups, people coming together to help to work on national, state, and local efforts. I will say that I think, there's a lot of good work that happens in the philanthropy space, but philanthropy isn't the answer. Philanthropy is not a substitute for public investments at the local, state, and federal level that are going to reduce these inequalities. It's too big of a problem to be solved with charity. It really will require coming together and rewiring the rules of the economy for shared prosperity as opposed to pulling apart. And we know something about that. I mean, that again, from 1945 to 1975, the rules of the economy helped us grow together. Some of those rules were racially discriminatory. Access to higher education, the GI Bill, was not universal. A lot of the programs that helped build middle-class white wealth through home ownership were racially discriminatory. But we know something about making the rules of the economy help us grow together as opposed to pull apart. Anyway, let me stop there, and we'll leave a little more time for our small groups and Q&A.
Chuck, thank you. That was tremendously helpful and interesting. So everybody, now we'd like to give you a chance to talk. We're going to break up into small groups for about, let's say, 15 minutes. We posted a couple of questions in the chat so that you can talk together about Chuck's presentation. So I suggest you introduce yourselves and then jump right into the questions. And Leela has posted the questions. And as soon as I shut up, she's going to send you an invitation to join a breakout room. So please join in, share some wisdom together, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes for some Q&A time with Chuck. Thanks. Leela, are we all back yet? We are. Okay, great. Chuck, are you ready for some questions? The first question is, if you're giving money away, would you send some to me? No, that's not really a question. That's let's see here, Chuck. So one of our attendees poses a question about the strategy that you described, Chuck, about how to address some of the inequality is with tax strategies of the wealthiest. And the concern here is now we're in a time and place where voter suppression and gerrymandering are essentially keeping the rich and powerful in control. So do you want to speak to that?
Well, I think that is a situation. And actually, in our small group, it was interesting to hear people talk about how states are pulling apart in terms of how they both what kind of social safety net they are. So some states are making it harder to vote. Other states are making it easier. And I think this is part of a kind of a defederalization. It's like we're going to see things really separate. So some states will be stronger in terms of their democratic and their response to inequality, and some will become more unequal. But here again, even with the capture of our political system, the current Congress came within 2 votes in the U.S. Senate of passing a $4 trillion investment bill that would have been paid for entirely by people with incomes over $400,000, most of it people with incomes over $1 million, an income over $1 million, not assets, income. So even in this current political environment, that's how close we came, and that shows that there's an undercurrent. So even if more and more people are running for office with an understanding of that. So it's true. It's going to be harder in some places to vote. We're going to become less democratic in certain states and regions, but the pressure is going to keep building for reform. When 80% of the population supports something and Congress is blocking it, that's not a sustainable situation. But yeah, we're heading into a situation, of minority rule, where a minority of the population is trying to block proposals that are wildly popular with the majority. And, how long can that last?
Chuck, someone writes, you've had some significant experience of interacting with people of wealth. in conversations about these topics. Do you have any stories to tell about a change of heart among the wealthiest of the wealthy in terms of their sense of how things need to change?
Yeah, I mean, I guess again in the good news category is I talk to people every day who are, asking these questions. I actually spoke this morning with somebody who his entire life he's been a trust attorney helping the wealthiest people in our society figure out how to hide their money and avoid taxes using trusts. And he's changing his life's work. He wants to be part of the fixing that, not perpetuating it. But yeah, there are very high net worth individuals who are concerned about these issues, who are stepping up, investing in, the solutions that some of which we've talked about. We're recognizing that philanthropy is, not a substitute for paying their fair share of taxes. If you're interested, check out, there's a network called the Patriotic Millionaires that I helped co-found. That's the name, patrioticmillionaires.org. And you'll see several hundred entrepreneurs, high net worth individuals who are publicly speaking out for fair taxes, higher living wages, and reducing the influence of money in politics. And they formed a global partnership. Now there are several hundred multimillionaires and billionaires from other parts of the world stepping in. In fact, they had a protest at Davos, which is the big meeting in Switzerland. Each year the global elites kind of gather. So I see, maybe one story though that I tell in Born on Third Base is speaking at a church, having an older man come up to me and say, I used to be the retired number 3 person at Boeing. And I'm very concerned about these inequalities. And I've been working with my church and building houses in Kenya. And I've met all these children at this orphanage, and they've completely cracked my heart open. And I've come back to Los Angeles County where I live, and I've been engaging other members in my congregation and other retired business leaders, and I think that's what I see is people, sometimes you have to go outside the United States to escape the stories and narratives of justification, but people's hearts get cracked open. And they want to, pursue more of a servant leadership approach. They're not. That's not everybody. I mean, I think there's a kind of a hardcore. I don't give up on anybody, but I think there's some tough cases when it comes to the power of money and inequality to kind of get people to hold on to their view, their worldview, and their stories and their mythologies. But I just see lots of cracks in the system. I wrote a book about the whole, what I call it, the wealth defense industry, the whole sector that serves ultra high net worth families and helps them, basically avoid taxes and hide their money. A lot of those people are stepping out of those jobs and coming over and helping us rewrite the laws. And so those are just a couple examples where I see people changing their hearts and minds.
Chuck, one participant writes in and says, thanks so much for the presentation. I'm going to share the video with my church. So thank you very much for that. And somebody else writes sort of a parallel to that, asking, do you have, or would you be willing to share some kind of fact sheet so that we can begin a conversation with people, that we can show, put hard data in front of folks just as kind of evidence as part of the conversation?
Yeah.
Something you can refer us to, Chuck?
Yeah, well, one resource. So I co-edit a website called Inequality.org, and there is, if you literally look across the top tab, you'll see data and chart packs. So we've put together packets of, illustrative charts and facts on these issues of inequality. So check out Inequality.org. I actually put out a little newsletter every Monday. So if you want, you could subscribe to that, or subscribe and check it out. If you don't like it, you can unsubscribe. But it's we try to have a little bit of a sense of humor. It's not all, bleak news. It's actually profiles of people doing stuff on inequality. There's always a campaign or action of the week, and lots of stories about both the hope and the harms of extreme inequality. So I would selfishly recommend inequality.org as a place. And that's where, you might find a chart pack or two that, a series of pictures that tell the story that I've been describing, and invite people into a conversation around those. And if what you find isn't good enough, doesn't meet that need, write to me at inequality.org, and we'll create that, like you say, a 1 to 2 pager. I think that's a great idea, a great tool. If you can't easily find it.
Chuck, related to that, another question kind of on a similar vein, and this is sort of comes under the category that we bump into somewhat frequently at Just Faith. Some people have a creative imagination, figure out something they want to work on, and kind of come up with strategies. So there's others of us, maybe I'm one of them, where we sort of like to paint by numbers, and we like someone to give us the paint and the numbers. In other words, if I wanted to respond to your talk tomorrow in the most effective way, besides not trying to do it on my own, give me 3 steps to start to get engaged in a way that's meaningful.
In some ways, you all are further along by virtue of having this connection to Just Faith. Often I talk to people in a religious congregation where there's no sort of civic infrastructure to participate or be connected to. But even within, say, I would say the first step is find your pod, find your posse. During the pandemic, we all had our little pods. Well, you sort of need to have your social action pod, and it could be one other person or 2 other people, or a group of people that maybe physically can meet up for coffee, and support one another to use your gifts to plug into something. So form a pod. There's a great network called Results that does work on hunger. And here's my cat is paying a visit here. She's very concerned about inequality. But they have this great face-to-face sort of small group action model that the climate lobby group has adopted a similar thing. So, and then I think within that, pick a pressure point. There are these different pressure points, and maybe you're plugging in, pick the thing that you see makes the most important difference in your place. And if, at the national level, if on these issues of taxes, Americans for Tax Fairness, on the racial wealth divide, there's a group, Prosperity Now, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. These are all groups that have public policy campaigns and agendas and say, well, we're going to be the Minnesota cell pod working on that. And we're going to make, do letters to the editor, and we're going to do advocacy visits. Some of the things are things that some of you have done and others haven't. So part of it is to bring more people along, train and invite younger people to be part of those. So there are people who've done the paint by number on the particular issue that you probably care about. And that's where having your pod, discerning what those 2 or 3 things that you feel called to do, assess your talents. It's amazing. I have a friend. He has a very full-time job, but darned if he doesn't write 2 to 3 letters to the editor in different newspapers in our community each month that are crafted and poetic and make really good points. And how few people take advantage of that. People read these letters to the editor in local papers, educational forums, congregational discussions and forums, putting a film series together. Our congregation has had a great film series that we call it Dismantling White Supremacy. And every month we have a film and a discussion and, an invitation to action. It's like Bread for the World does a great job with their offering of letters. This whole idea that, okay, we're going to write letters and we're going to sit together and do that and make them really an offering and send them in together. So that, I think, and I know the Just Faith team is good at sort of breaking these things down into bites. So stay with your Just Faith connections. That's an important place to be involved.
Chuck will get you your $25 later for saying that. Hey, one of the folks on the call tonight actually is part of a family in which some of the family members have great wealth. And she writes that it's just so difficult to initiate any kind of conversation with those family members. Given your experience, do you have any advice for this person?
Well, I actually think the book I wrote, Born on Third Base, has been helpful to, and maybe it's offering that book, but I think part of it's just the art of asking questions. Maybe like the question that we started with, what do you see? Do you see these inequalities that are opening up in our society? Do you see how any of the harms, I think each of us probably have to draw on whatever interpersonal insights we have, not to put people on the defensive or shut doors, but try to open them. So it requires a certain amount of creative compassion and, so I don't have any cookie cutter advice there, except inviting people to be in community, inviting people to come to an event or, have a conversation or meet someone. And then, a book like Born on Third Base, there's another a woman who wrote, We Need to Talk, Conversations About Wealth. Jennifer Risher is her name. She's talks about her own experience growing up middle class, but then working at Microsoft and, becoming a Microsoft gazillionaire because of that. So finding examples that might connect to that person's experience, and honoring the individual effort. I think you sort of people who in their lifetime have accumulated substantial wealth have certain gifts and skills and probably have made sacrifices and even lost the quality of time with family sometimes because they're trying to build their livelihood or build a business. So acknowledging the sacrifices or seeing the person is, I guess the way I would try to really see them, how they see themselves, what are the stories that they believe about themselves and what's true, and honoring that as a way to open up a discussion.
That's helpful. Chuck, I think we're near time, so I want to invite all of those who are on the call to express their appreciation with a hand clap or a handshake. Thanks again. It was so enlightening for me. I appreciate it. So thanks.
My pleasure. Thank you all for coming, spending an evening together, and feel free to reach out through inequality.org. You can find me, and if you have any questions, thoughts, feel free to email. I'm not inaccessible. So
just to reiterate what Leela said at the beginning, Leela will be sending an email to all of you with a video link for tonight's presentation. So feel free to share it widely if you like. We encourage you to do that. Also in that email will be an invitation for you to join the Just Faith Network. Almost every week, we send some kind of resource to all members of the network at no charge. So please take advantage of this free offering. Okay, it's true. Very few things in life are really free. So 3/4 of our operating budget for Just Faith Ministries is provided by the generosity of folks like you who participate in one of our programs or events. In other words, Just Faith is a gift from our past participants to our future participants. So tonight's presentation was free, of course, but we invite you to partner with us to offer opportunities like this as a gift to the world, to the next group of people who will be on this conversation next month, maybe. Finally, I'd like to invite you to next month's Acting for Justice event on Thursday, July 21st, as Archbishop John Wester of the Catholic Archdiocese of Santa Fe will discuss his recent pastoral letter, Living in the Light of Christ's Peace, a conversation toward nuclear disarmament, in which he calls for a rejuvenated and sustained conversation about verifiable worldwide nuclear disarmament. So please join us next month. I will close our time together with a short prayer. And so until next month, we at Just Faith Ministries wish you well. Remember to celebrate Juneteenth on Monday. And thank you for joining us. Let us pray. The same God that made us, that made the world, can also redeem us and redeem the world. How? First, by being generous, all creation was birthed. Second, by being generous, all creation is invited to restoration. There is only one way to be saved by a generous God, and that is the way of generosity. Give it away, give it away, give it away, and all creation will sing. And I bet so will your brothers and sisters. Amen. Good night, everybody.